Do Kickstarter games lack substance? Are they worse than other games? Much more inferior? All their flaws, their problems, their rule books that aren't fully developed, their FAQs and errata that get published after the fact, those broken game mechanics that just don't work, all those issues that are completely prevalent in all their Kickstarter games. Are Kickstarter games just a flash in the pan that we all keep pursuing? Or not? And if you see the stacks of games all around me, you might already have an idea of where this video is going. I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. And before I continue, think for a second, how many games on Board Game Geek, out of the top 100 games of all time, how many of them do you think are Kickstarter games? Take down your answer, I'll tell you at some point during the video. What about the top 1,000? How many of the top 1,000 are Kickstarter games? And how many Kickstarter games are there in general compared to the general ecosystem of board games? Now, speaking for myself, depending on when this video actually goes up, when I think it's going to go up, for myself, 14 out of my top 50 games of all time are currently Kickstarter games. I'm going to be doing a top 50. The first video went up yesterday, assuming I did this video when I thought I did. The first video went up yesterday and the rest will be coming out soon. But out of my top 50 games of all time, as of 2020, 14 of them are Kickstarter games. That's 28%. But of course, I'm biased because I like Kickstarter. Clearly, my content is all focused around Kickstarter. Which means that when we get to the fact that 26 out of the top 100 games on Board Game Geek are Kickstarter games. That's 26%. 26 games. That's an insane number. And 204 or 20% out of the top 1,000 are Kickstarter games, which again is a large number. And in case you are wondering, there are 11,010 recorded Kickstarter games on Board Game Geek, and there are 123,100 games, or only 8% of the total are Kickstarter games. So if 8% of all the games on Board Game Geek are Kickstarter games, and 20% are in the top 1,000, 26% are in the top 100, 28% are my own top 50, I wonder for yourself, let me know how many of your top 10, top 20, top 30, just give me some sort of number in the comments down below as far as your own collection, and where Kickstarter games lie in that collection. How many of your top 30, top 40, top 50 games are Kickstarter games? Which leads to the next question of why? Why are they rated higher? Because when you think about it, we hear nothing except for the fact that Kickstarter games have their problems. And they do have their problems. Right now, the most recent drama is going to be Awakened Realms and Etherfields and their games, but it's not the first nor the last time. I have a whole other video coming about when I'm okay house ruling stuff and when I'm not okay house ruling things, and I'll give you a bit of a spoiler to that video. Every single game I cover in that video is a Kickstarter game. Both the ones I'm okay with and not okay with, they're all Kickstarter games. And it's not that other games don't require house rules or corrected rule books or anything like that. It's not. They certainly do exist. But there's less focus, there's less attention, and often it's less frequent. And there's a whole bunch of reasons as to why that exists. And part of that's going to be the established publishing houses behind it. Part of that's going to be the fact that there are companies like Fantasy Flight or whoever that are going to be maintaining those rules, maintaining that process that they have for getting things out. There's also less of a time crunch. If your game is 2 months, 2 years late, no one's hounding you trying to figure out when they're getting their copy of insert name here. We don't have that luxury in the Kickstarter world. Once you tell people there's going to be a product, if that product is not fully and finally developed by the time the Kickstarter funds, well then you still have to go through whatever form of playtesting, iteration, component changes, whatever it is. And you have to do all of that under a time crunch because every single time you post an update saying that your Kickstarter game is late, you will have people who are unhappy. There will always be those who are understanding, always be those who say, you know what, I'd rather have a better game delivered later than a game with an errata delivered sooner. But the problem is that's only a small subset of people. There are just as many people who want to get their game now, and they want their game to be as good as possible now, which is understandable. I want that as well. But you can't always get what you want. And that pressure means that Kickstarter games are going to have more flaws, more issues than a non-Kickstarter game. So why are they rated so highly? If we have an incentive in place as to why they should be worse, arguably they should be worse. And again, going back to that publishing house part, when you put out a new game behind Fantasy Flight, behind Days of Wonder, behind any established company, they have checks and balances in place. They have systems set up. They have done this before. They know what they're doing. So it's more likely, you'd argue, that they should put out a better game. It's more likely that they would not fall into pitfalls of creation, of publication, of any number of different issues that someone else might have when they're kickstarting a game. Kickstarter has been the age of new companies, of smaller enterprises. Sure, we have the giants, we have the Awakened Realms, the Cool Mini or Nots, the who knows what, but we also have tons of small companies. Companies that, arguably by your own standard might not be small, but they're full of, I mean, Chip Theory Games was a tiny company. Roxley, who is Roxley? We have Everdell, Starling Games. We have any number of, Spirit Island, Greater Than Games, all these different companies that are arguably by any reasonable standard, small companies. Cephalair, any number of these games that just, how did they get to where they are? They didn't have that house, that knowledge, that baseline of information behind them. And so how are they putting out such good games? And I think the answer to a certain extent is threefold. But before we go into that, let's go through those top 26 games on Board Game Geek. I'll rattle through them quickly. I don't have all of them. I try to grab everything I actually own from those top 100. And these, by the way, in case you're wondering, are not necessarily my top 14. These are just Board Game Geek's top 100. And we have Pax Pamir coming in at 98. We have Raiders of the North Sea coming in at 88. Tainted Grail. We have Rising Sun, Paladins of the West Kingdom, Architects of the West Kingdom, Barrage, On Mars. And by the way, Barrage is not actually pronounced Barrage. I don't remember how it's pronounced, but it's pronounced differently than that. We have On Mars, Anne's End, Lisboa, Keyflower, The Gallerist, Too Many Bones, Anachrony, Clans of Caledonia, Everdell, Kingdom Death Monster, Blood Rage, Seventh Continent, Root, Nemesis, Orleans, Brass Birmingham, Brass, one of these. Brass Lancashire, I think, is first, then Root, then Nemesis, Spirit Island, Scythe, Brass Birmingham, and finally, of course, Gloomhaven, which was a Kickstarter game. All of those are in the top 100 games of all time. That's 26 titles, which again is an absolutely insane number. Or is it 27? I may have messed it up. I think it's 26. Either way. But anyways, I think it comes down to three reasons as to why Kickstarter games are better than normal. Why they have a higher percentage of the top 100 than they should otherwise get. And the first of that is removal of the typical cost infrastructure. The fact that a game can be published on Kickstarter, it takes away initially, at least until they enter distribution and things happen and things change. Many of these games have entered distribution. Once a game is popular, people want to carry it. I mean, a game that makes its way into the top ranks of Board Game Geek, people want to sell that game again and again and again. But removal of that typical cost infrastructure is going to help to begin with. It gives you more freedom and more leeway to create something that is aspiring, to be frank. Games like Kingdom Death Monster couldn't exist without Kickstarter. Couldn't exist if you had that additional publisher and distributor the retailer and distributor in that mix, taking percentages of the profit. Chip Theory Games to this day still only sells on their own website because of the fact that those games are so expensive to manufacture, to make, that they couldn't endure the typical cost infrastructure. Any number of Cool Mini or Not games, or Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven would never have been made at that price point initially. It couldn't possibly. Take a look at the New Descent 3.0 by Fantasy Flight Games, and the price point on that. Gloomhaven has spoiled us as to what you can actually get for $100 in a box. It is absolute insanity that you can get this. Think about it. Think about it practically. This box is literally like 4 times the content of a $40, $50 game. How are we getting it for $100 whenever it's on Amazon or who knows where? It's an insane thing to behold, and it's only possible because of Kickstarter. Any number of the Cool Mini and Not games or whatever it is, when they come up with deluxeified extras and all that, they can give you that much content, that much extra stuff because of the fact that it's on Kickstarter, because of the fact that they are eliminating that price point. Putting a game out on Kickstarter frees you from a lot of the cost structure that would make something otherwise unsustainable. There are any number of other games on this list I can go through, from Nemesis to the On Mars, all those series, the way they give you those gigantic big boxes initially with all the extra content. Some things can be created, can be envisioned because of the nature of Kickstarter. And secondly is going to be the fact that that same degree of price point, many games on Kickstarter, including many of these top games, of those top 200 on Board Game Geek, are expensive games. They are games that could never enter typical distribution because no publisher, no one's going to sit there and say, you know what? Let's just go ahead and make a $150 game and hope people buy it off the shelves. Let's invest. Let's take our time, our energy, our money, and put it into some concept, just hoping and praying that people will pay that much money for a game. And so again, Kickstarter gives us an opportunity to break those barriers because you don't actually have to make it until people pledge money. There's certainly risk involved, don't get me wrong. You still have to design a product, you still have to come up with all the Kickstarter stuff, the publishing, the marketing, all these things you still have to do. But you don't actually have to print 10,000 copies of a game that you won't sell, which is a significant savings in what you can do. And so Kickstarter again opens us up to some degree of freedom of what we can potentially try to get away with, the games we can create, the experiences we can imagine, and the price points that we might otherwise have to set on those experiences. Kickstarter is again freeing in that sense. It gives you a bandwidth that normal retail distribution simply does not have. It is a tool in Kickstarter's favor. Number 3 is going to be that freedom from oversight, that same exact aspect, that aspect of being under Fantasy Flight, being under Days of Wonder or whoever, under Ravensburger or whatever it is. Being under a typical company does give you a lot of constraints, a lot of here's what you can do and here's what you can do well. But it also removes you from experiential things. It removes you from experiments, not experiential. It removes you from experiments. The idea that you can sit there and take a risk, the idea that you can envision something, again, looking at Gloomhaven. Who would have thought that this could be a real concept, a real board game? Any of these games, I mean, Root, that for a totally asymmetric game, completely on its own, like every single faction is different. I mean, the idea of all these experiences, Too Many Bones, Ship Theory games, and their neoprene mats and ships, and that's all they're going to do. Their whole entire game is waterproof. Who wants to sit there and invest money into a concept like that and say, hey, the people will pay for it? Removal from that typical oversight, that typical aspect of, hey, here's what we've done well for the past 10 years, and here's what we're going to continue to do well. Fantasy Flight is a great company, do not get me wrong, but to a certain extent, they lack imagination. To a certain extent, they've been recycling the same concepts, the same thing again and again and again. It doesn't matter how much I like Marvel Champions. It's a great game, but at the same time, it's still just a recycled concept. There is less freedom the larger the company goes. You have to stick to bounds. Again, Marvel is a good example in and of itself. Marvel is a fantastic company with a fantastic series of movies, but they follow a very formulaic structure, making them all entertaining, but also most of them are basically the same to a degree, and that's going to apply to any larger company. That removal from oversight, that removal from what we can and can't do. Everdell sitting there with their giant wooden tree on your table and their squishy berries. It makes the game better. It does. It loops you into that experience, and it wouldn't exist in a retail game. These things just don't happen. Even today, as we see these things slowly starting to filter down into retail, the fact that they can make a Descent 3.0 and charge $175 for that box, they've only done that because they've seen the market will pay. Kickstarter, even when these things filter down, it's only because Kickstarter has taught people what consumers of board games are willing to do. If you love a board game enough, what you're willing to pay for, what you're willing to try, what you're willing to test out. And so yes, some of these things will slowly filter their way down into retail, but it's still only because of Kickstarter. And then reason number 4, and this is the one that nobody wants to hear, or at least depends who you are, maybe you do want to hear it, there's going to be a certain amount of justifying our own purchases into those ratings as well. I don't think it's a lot, don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, when we pay a lot of money, when you pay $30 for a game and you don't like it, it's easier to move on from than when you pay $200 from a game and you really want to like it. And I've been there. I don't keep games that I don't like, don't get me wrong. I mean, Reichbusters is one of the games I was most excited to get and play. I played and then moved on from because it wasn't a game for me. But take Etherfields for an example. Etherfields is a game that does have flaws, and I love it. Don't get me wrong. I've been enjoying it every single time, and I can't wait to dive back in. But at the end of the day, Etherfields does have flaws, and there might be a certain degree of rationalization of, hey, I want this game, I got this game, I'm experiencing this game, don't tell me I don't like it. Dice Throne. Dice Throne is a game that I did keep longer than I otherwise would have, because it was so very pretty and I paid a lot of money for it. Both those things are true. I think the pretty is actually more of a reason why I kept it, but nonetheless, we do to a certain extent justify our own decisions, and I think that will be a factor in play. But at the end of the day, I think that's a small factor. I think Kickstarter delivers us amazing, incredible experiences. I think Kickstarter has continued to deliver well-rated, well-liked games. It also delivers duds. It also delivers horrific experiences that no one is talking about 4 years later, or perhaps they are talking about it, but only in a negative way. The amount of times I've seen a Kickstarter hit someone's shelf, and then they try trading it or selling it, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna pay through the nose to get their hands on that. And then 2 years later, no one cares, and you can barely get anything for it. Sometimes things are just bad. Kickstarter doesn't make a game great, but Kickstarter to a certain extent does give you freedom and tools to potentially make a game great where you wouldn't have already. If you like this channel, if you've watched my videos, then you already know how I feel about Kickstarter. Again, 14 out of my top 50 games are in Kickstarter. And I think none of them were in my top, I think it was 14 out of my top 40 even. I don't think any of them were even, that last 10 I don't actually think were any Kickstarter games. I'd have to look at the video again. I like the promise that Kickstarter gives us. I like the options it gives us. I like the games it gives us. There are so many incredible experiences that are to be had on the platform. And then when you get the games, Kingdom Rush is a game that, I'm trying to think when this review goes up. I'm trying to think when this video goes up, but I believe Kingdom Rush, there'll be a review coming on Saturday, I think. I'm trying to remember my schedule right now. But it's a game that I'm really enjoying. It's a game that I'm having a lot of fun with. I have critiques. The rulebook should be better. but the rest of the game is solidly fun. Super Fantasy Brawl was an incredible experience for me. I really, really enjoyed that game. Endless Winter is a game that's not even out yet, and I'm having a ton of fun with it. On this table over here, Blood Rage is such a good game. Rum and Bones, Rise of Moloch, any number of these games from Cool Mini or not, they're such incredible experiences. Chip Theory games, Too Many Bones, Undertow, it's such a good game. Spirit Island is an incredible experience. Everdell, Brass. There are so many good titles to be had out there, and there are so many titles that are coming to us from Kickstarter. Does it have its flaws? 100% it does. Does it produce things that occasionally don't get the level of oversight or introspection is the wrong word, of oversight that I want? There are games that don't get the level of oversight, the level of cleaning up. But I think that will change. I think as the industry continues to develop, certain things will become standard. Things like getting professional rulebook editors on your games will to a certain extent become the norm. No different than game trays. Right now we have game trays on every single game, and this game has game trays, has deluxeified components, it has miniatures. There are things that are standard parts of the Kickstarter experience. Those things don't have to be limited to upgrades. They could be a stamp that Paul Grogan from Gaming Rules is doing the rules for this Kickstarter. Jesse Anderson from Quackalope is responsible for the flavor text. There's any number of different things we can do on a Kickstarter page that becomes standard, that become a stamp of approval, a stamp that typical flaws that otherwise have gone unnoticed in past experiences, they won't always go unnoticed. There is room to streamline, there is room to optimize. And realistically, I think the only place we have to go is up in this space. And whether it does or doesn't, I'm enjoying the games I have so far. I hopefully will enjoy the games that keep on coming. I don't know. Some are wins, some not so much. I have a big Kickstarter, a very big one. That is not one I'll be keeping. I don't think it's a bad game, but it's not one I'll be keeping. You'll see that in my collection updates or whatnot. In any case, this has been my little bit of not a rant, but an introspection, conversation about, are Kickstarter games good? Do they lack substance? I don't know what the title for this video is yet, but I'm sure I'll figure it out before it actually goes up. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. As a reminder, post down in the comments down below what percentage of your top whatever are Kickstarter games. I'm very curious to know. Granted, it's a Kickstarter-centric audience, but nonetheless, I am very interested in knowing. And until next time, have a good one.